So, my research focuses on understanding climate change. And CO2, or carbon dioxide, is the main cause of climate change. And the main source of CO2 is human activities. So really, I study where the people are, which is cities. People are moving to cities more and more over time. By 2050, about 70% of the world will be living in cities. That's over 6 billion people. So it's not that surprising that cities are responsible for the majority of carbon dioxide emissions too. But cities get this, and there are global groups of cities working to try and understand and reduce their emissions. In fact, our home state of New York recently passed some major legislation on this front. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act set into law some major reduction targets and some ways to meet them. But that brings up an important question. How do we know that the changes that we make on the ground actually reduce emissions as much as we think they will? We need to know what emissions are now and have a way to track them over time. And we've actually got two ways to do this. There are bottom-up methods and top-down methods. The bottom-up methods involve adding up all the pieces. What does traffic emit? What do power plants emit? What does residential heating emit? And in the end, putting all these pieces together, you get a nice map of what the emissions look like, shown here. But this is from 2015. That's the most recent version of this bottom-up that we have. And it's because it takes a lot of time and effort to put these maps together. It takes a few years to even have the data that you need. The top-down approach, on the other hand, we go out and we measure the amount of CO2 in the air downwind, and then relate that back to how much came from the city. So we've got a plane, and it's fully equipped to make these kind of measurements. So we flew around New York City in 2018, 2019, and 2020, March and November, to do this kind of work. We got some beautiful pictures of the city like this. But as a scientist, my favorite pictures that we've got look more like this. On the right, you can see our flight path here. So we flew up the Hudson River. This green here are the 5 boroughs of New York City, and this is Long Island. Now on the right, you can see CO2 over time. We were flying over the ocean at the beginning, we had very little CO2. When we were over the city, we had very high CO2. And then once we got north of that into the suburbs, we got sort of a middling CO2. But this isn't just New York City. It's really New York City and everything upwind of New York City. So we've kind of got two issues here. One, how do we get New York City by itself and get rid of this plus other? And two, how do we go from amount of CO2 in the air to amount that the city emitted? The answer to both questions is models. You've seen a weather report before. We know what the winds were doing, and we can use that information to really understand what exactly were we measuring during this flight. And it looks something like this. So the darker the red here, the more important that is for our measurements. And so we really sampled New York City, Long Island, and a little bit of New Jersey. And if we combine this with what we think the CO2 emissions are there, in other words, our bottom up, then we can really get a good idea of what CO2 should have looked like if both of these were perfect. That gives us our red estimate here. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. And so we can directly compare this estimate to what we measured and adjust it accordingly. We're using the area under the curve, or the total CO2 measured during the flight, to do that. And we have to double the estimate to make them match here. But this is one flight, and we need good confidence in our numbers. So we actually have 9 different flights, and most of them look more like this, where the measured and estimated are in much better agreement. So our average multiplier is actually 1.2. So we can take our bottom-up number, 7,000 tons of CO2 an hour, apply our multiplier of 1.2 based on measurements, to get a final New York City number of 8,000 tons of CO2 an hour. That means that our little city of New York emits the same as the country Greece. The idea of this project is if we repeat these measurements over time, then we can understand how emissions change over time as these policies get implemented. And we can really answer the question, are we going in the right direction? Thank you very much.